So here we are in the wee hours of December the 24th. Happy holidays to those of you watching it at that time. Got my dog beside me, so if you hear the occasional sigh or a little flapping of ears, that would be him. I'm going to talk a little bit more about stuff relating to painting. So hopefully you guys have, those of you that are following along anyways, have painted out some studies of the cube and sphere that I suggested in the last video. If you didn't feel that you've done a good enough job, remember, you should always try again. Don't just be satisfied with doing it once and say, oh, I've done it, I'm good. Try it again and again and again. Try it in different ways. Maybe try and not do it the exact same way that I showed you to do it. See if there's other ways that you can accomplish it. Remember that my way is not necessarily the best way in the world. Lots of people paint these things with different methods, and it's up to you to try and determine what works best for you. So do lots of those. Let's actually move to this one. What I want to focus on in this particular video is talking about light and, of course, doing a different kind of studies. So I'm going to start off with talking about light first. So I like to break it down into A.R.T. Art. It's easy to remember. And so we've got absorption, where light hits the surface and it's absorbed. We have reflection, where light hits the surface and it reflects back, comes back to the eye. And we have trans, which is transparency, where the light passes straight through, and translucence, where it scatters. Another word for this we often hear is subsurface scattering, which is an interesting little term. Essentially, that just means that it goes beneath the surface into the object and it scatters. So subsurface scattering. So translucency is all about that. What you have to remember with this is that within here we have a overall value, a percentage that we're considering. So if 10% is absorbed, then we're left with only 90% to do reflection or to pass through the object. So if then we say, okay, well, it's really, a lot of light is passing through it, then we have to make the decision, say, okay, well, it's 90% translucent or transparent. And then we say, okay, well, if 10% was absorbed and 90 is passing through, then there's not any left for reflectivity. And we have to really consider that. It really is a simple game of numbers. So we're always looking to work out these different values anytime we look at a surface that we're trying to reproduce, which is what I want you guys to focus on in this particular set of exercises. So when you look at your reference, I want you to really break it down. I want you to look at the object that you're looking at and determine, is it absorbing light? How do we know it's absorbing light? Well, something that is black in value would likely be absorbing light, unless, of course, it's in shadow, where light is not actually reaching it. And we have to make a determination about that. So if light is definitely hitting that surface, and yet it is still showing up as black, then light is definitely being absorbed. And not just black, but a darker value than you expect it should be. Is it reflective? Well, it's pretty easy to tell. How reflective is it will determine or be determined by looking at how much of that light value that you might be getting back. And that's something that we have to talk about a little bit further. And of course, how much light is passing through it. So those are those values that we're looking at. If we take a look at this, we have glass. Fairly reflective, transparent. It's got all these different things. And then we have white paper. Well, we look at the glass and we say, oh, I can see my reflection in it. I can see the highlights across there. It's definitely reflective. I grab the piece of paper, can't see myself in it. I can see that, it's being illuminated, but it's not really, anything beyond that. So I might say that glass is more reflective than paper. However, that would be wrong. The reality is, glass has a reflectance value of 0.02. if 100% was a value of 1, it's 0.02, whereas paper can go anywhere, depending on the grade of paper, from 0.7 to 0.8 in terms of reflectivity. Note that the color of it is white. White is the value of light, which is red, green, and blue all together, meaning it's reflecting all ranges of colors, and it's coming back with a lot of value. White paint and white paper is used by photographers to help them reflect. It's been used in even some greenhouses where people have created, a little area that they can't make transparent from all angles, and they'll paint the interior white or put up white paper if they can't afford the paint. And that will just allow them to reflect more light, more of the sunlight back onto the plants so they grow a little bit better. So consider that this is a highly reflective surface. Now, why is it white? Why am I not seeing my face? Well, because the surface is very rough, and what we end up with is a diffuse reflection. Now, if we go back to this over here and we say, okay, well, we have absorption, reflectance, so reflectivity, and then in trans we have transparence and translucence. Well, transparence is light just passing through, and translucence is the scattering of light passing through it. Why isn't there a separate name here? Well, reflectivity, we often have different versions of what kind of reflection it is. So it'd be a glossy reflection or a diffuse reflection, or some people might say even a specular reflection. So it just has to do with how polished or rough the surface is, but it has nothing to do with how reflective it is. When we look at these two things, we have to consider that this object being white and appearing white means it is highly reflective. When we're doing studies, material studies, what I would like you to focus on is trying to recreate the material, but not necessarily its shape. I also want to consider the material in every single aspect. So here I'm getting a glossy reflection. This was supposed to be jello, and you can see that the reflection is broken up across that surface because I've made little grooves or simulated the idea of grooves. I've got little lights dancing in there from little bubbles and other elements there that allowed it to get these kind of broken up little shapes. And of course then I have light passing through it. I've got this little bit of a red glow down into the shadow because light is passing through and hitting the surface, but not all the light is passing through. We're getting a little bit of a diffuse shadow going on there. So I want you to think about the material in terms of those values, that A.R.T. Is it absorbing? Is it reflecting? Is it transmitting? So this was supposed to be, for each one of these were about 10 minutes. We have some more here. Try to do copper. And the idea of copper is that it's reflective. It's more of a glossy reflection, although not perfectly glossy. So the shapes on it are a little bit more blurry, but they are focused enough that I can see them. So I simulated the idea of it reflecting some kind of dark shape here, different broken up areas. I was thinking about it being a room and with a window, with maybe a curtain or multiple windows there with a beam in between them or something like that. So I created these little shapes in here for it to reflect. And I also considered that it's reflecting this large shape right here, which would block off some of the light and create a dark area. Also, I have a little highlight here to represent from the flame that's coming over here. As I did the wood, I did the same kind of idea. I looked at this and think, okay, well, a little bit of light might reflect up into here, so I put a little bit of a slight warm value, but I figured it wouldn't be a lot of light, so it's really, really subtle. And of course, overhead light casting down onto these things, onto all of them really, and hitting the surface. And of course, a little bit of a glow here from the light here, and then my translucent surface. I created crevices to give the idea of how these things should look. And I looked at different references to try and figure that out. Try and keep them connected to your environment. Give a nice display. When you're trying to do a study and you really want to spend maybe about 30 minutes per material, especially when you're starting out. These ones, maybe each one was about 15 minutes for these ones, but I've been doing a fair number of studies, so when you get more experience, more practice using the tools and really understanding the materials, you can, of course, speed up that process so you can do more of them in a given amount of time. I did another one here, which was a big picture that had lava in it, and so it had some of these forms in it, areas that were glowing, and of course the chunky broken areas that were there. And this one, again, I took a short amount of time just to go ahead and produce this, and then I added some smoke and just, again, a kind of background and casting sort of like a bit of a shadow, like it's hovering, but it's all these elements. So I looked at all the things there, tried to reproduce them in different zones of this object, and tried to have a little bit of presentation so it felt nice. So it's not just about trying to reproduce what you see, but it's about understanding it and then trying to do a nice presentation, just in case you do want to stick it in your portfolio and show that off. Let's take a look at this object. This is a translucent material, so this is wax. We can see it reflects. We can see that we're getting this light at the edge here. We can see the way that the shadow works, and we see a big deep shadow back here. As we try and break this down, we can recognize that the less distance that the light has to pass through will determine that it becomes brighter. So it's passing through these edges, coming from this direction, coming down and hitting this surface. We can see the direction based on where the shadow is. That means that the light is coming down and hitting this and casting that shadow from this tip here. So it's hitting the surface, casting through at that angle. So we're seeing the reflection, which is an angled direction. It's coming back to our eye, which means it's bouncing off there. Think about pool balls on a table, and you hit the corner and then it comes towards you. It's not because the person hit it directly at you, it's because it's hit a corner and bounced in your direction. So that's what happens with some of these highlights as well. We notice that the interior of these are well lit for the same reason that these are well lit, because it's a short distance from the light hitting that wall on the back there and passing through it and becoming fully illuminated, so much so that the light value here is almost completely the same, so we don't actually see this edge. And as we get through, we may start to notice that the edge becomes more visible, perhaps the feeling that more light is actually passing through, and that has to do with certain values of reflectivity, etc., and the distance, again, that is passing through. As we look at these areas, we notice that the interior of these are more bright than the back quarter. Now remember that these are all within that shadow region. We can clearly determine the direction of the light based on the shadow. It points in the direction that light is coming from, and then the height is gauged by this. So we know that light is coming from over there, and it is casting through and hitting these interiors before it falls off. So again, that distance is shorter on the interior of these things. Now another thing to consider is that we see this completely black here, we see this highlight here, and there's the idea of exposure. So the exposure of the camera means that it can only absorb a certain amount of light. Now, I was talking in values of 0 to 1 with regards to those materials, how reflective it is and how reflective it wasn't. And I told you at first that that was a percentage, which is really how you have to think about it, because light is not determined in a value of just simply 0 to 1. What we have here is light has huge amounts of values, so much so that it's way beyond what the camera, within a given level of exposure, can actually absorb. So that means that When we look here, we see this white region. That either means that it is at the top level of the exposure or beyond the top level of the exposure. So again, higher than the top level of value that this exposure can accept. Now, by the same token, we have the shadow area. The shadow area appears black, but we know that light is passing through this object. It is passing through and it is touching this surface, but we're not seeing it. Again, that exposure has a maximum value as well as a minimum value that is allowed for it to expose that film or that sensor. Now, light is passing through and it is hitting that surface, so therefore there would be light values there. Now, if you look at old paintings, let's say a Rembrandt, for example, sometimes we'll look at those things and feel like they might even be beyond what we see in a photograph. We may even feel that if we allow ourselves to just kind of absorb that information, that it feels like it's even three-dimensional, that we can reach in and touch the space. And that is because we are seeing things that were painted and represented by their own eyeballs. They were looking at these things and their eyes were adjusting to the different light values because our eyes have that ability. They can move through more than what a regular camera can deal with its singular exposure. Now, with HDR cameras, people absorb more information into the sensor and it will be stored inside the camera, and they'll do HDR images where they can kind of fake some of that. They can go ahead and pull some of those values in. So sometimes you can get some of that. But when you look at these references, really try and think about what's going on in there and maybe make some adjustments. Go ahead and think about where it's going, but also still respect your source material. Respect the fact that within this exposure we have this much light here, and if I'm only putting this much light here, then I consider, that these areas would be rather dark based on the current lighting conditions. And if they weren't, that maybe there was another light source, another way that light was reflecting into this. Let's take a look at this image. So this is another image from the internet. We'll notice that there's a warm color here and a cold color here, and they are extremely bright. They're extremely blown out. That is that exposure again. We see that these areas are really dark. Again, exposure. If I was in this environment, this may not appear black, and this may not appear bright white. Again, my eyes can see more than this there. Another factor is, as I said, this is a warm value and this is a cold value. Does that mean there's a large blue light out here and a large, orangey light over here? No. This is direct sunlight. The sunlight is actually coming from this direction and hitting down in this area somehow as it blasts in. And all this light that's in this area, this is all being illuminated by reflected light. So it's not direct light. Light is streaming through and bouncing around this environment, creating that light. This is blue because there's another light source in the sky. It's the sky itself. The blue of the sky is light coming from the sun that's been diffused and scattered throughout the entire environment. And in fact, some of that skylight is also coming through here. Remember that it comes from all different directions. If this was an overcast day, chances are you would see a lessened blue value, and it would also be that same value here because on overcast days, light is coming from every single direction because all we're getting is a scattered light because it's passing through the clouds. So there's not a specific direct point where the light is coming through. Most of it is really scattered. So these are things to consider about how light behaves. Remember that there's values above and below a given exposure. Remember that the sky itself is a large light source, not just the direct sunlight itself. A factor about this that makes a big difference is that you want to give the illusion of shadows outdoors. Often cases, they will be diffused with blue light, giving them a bluish tinge. And you notice that there is a bluish tinge to a lot of this image. There's warm values here and cool values here because this is light coming from the sky. And it's an extreme version of it, which is why I've chosen this image in particular. But in terms of exterior shots where we're not on the inside and just having this diffused light coming through, we have this consideration of, I see direct sunlight, I see a shadow on the ground, what values are in it? If it's illuminated and it's not completely black, then we're looking at that. Now, one of these factors here, again, is that if I was in space, so out of our atmosphere, remember that this is atmospheric scattering. This is light coming from the atmosphere. That means in space, I have only one directional light, which means the shadows would be absolutely black. The dark side of the moon is truly absolutely black. There's not enough light to illuminate it, not that we can see anyways. So these are all factors that we have to try and come to terms with. So when you're thinking about light, again, remember there's maximum and minimum values within exposure, but there are also values outside there. You can always fudge that a little bit. You can always look at your reference with your own eyes and try and paint that rather than, painting just from photos. Consider that there's a percentage system that's in place, that if I have 10% absorption, I have 90% of that, the rest of that light to play with, to go through reflectivity or transparency. Consider these very clearly in terms of looking at the different materials that you're playing with. And when it comes down to actually doing these studies, sit down and, like I said, spend 30 minutes trying to analyze what you're looking at and put these together. As you get more experienced, you can spend less time, but you really do want to have a nice presentation. And my recommendation to you in terms of these studies would be to maybe do as many as 5 in a week, each one only taking a maximum of 30 minutes. 30 minutes is something that you can easily say, okay, I'm going to sit down for 30 minutes, I'm going to just do this one study, and then just let it go. Get up, and it will still be going in your mind. You'll still be thinking about it, thinking about how you can do it again, how you might do it differently. And it's much better than sitting down and saying, okay, well, I'm going to do like 15 studies or 30 studies all today. And you sit there for, 15 hours doing each one 30 minutes, one right after the other, and your hand cramps up and you got the claw of death, and, your brain's extremely tired and you pass out at your computer, and oh my God, it's just not going to work. Not just because of those reasons, but also because you really won't absorb that information. It's too much. You want to give yourself time to absorb it. So, you do 30 minutes on Monday, and then you go and do all the other stuff that you have to do for the day. You can just say, come home, watch some TV, after doing whatever I needed to do, sit down, 30 minutes, I'll do one study. And then the next day, I'll go and do all the stuff that I have to do and everything like that. I'll sit down 30 minutes, one study. And you can do that throughout the week, and you'll start to absorb the information. It will start to flow through better. So don't try and do too many all at once. Try and scatter them out. Spend only a small amount of time on them. Just really allow yourself to understand this, because it's about understanding the materials. It's about understanding light. Understanding what you are seeing. That is the important part of doing these types of studies. In order to assist you with that, again, putting a little bit of presentation in here, creating something for them to sort of sit on, to cast shadow. Maybe putting multiples together in a scene to give the illusion of, different light sources or different things to reflect. Creating fake reflections in there and try and understand where they are, not just painting exactly what you see. And what can help you with that, again, is changing the shape of the object. Maybe this was, a copper cylinder or a copper teapot. Turn it into a sphere. Turn it into a cube. Try and paint things that are not exactly the shape as you reference, so that you have a better understanding of what they really are. And again, painting different areas of even a single photo to try and understand the different regions, the glowing hot lava, the smoke, the layers of cooling yet still quite hot areas, the chunky bits, and the train in the background that you probably just heard go beep. We have so many things that we can do here. Just paused for a moment because that train was really distracting. So 30 minutes, keep it down to that. Do lots of different studies throughout your week. Give yourself time to kind of absorb and just spend that time on it. So hopefully this was informative. You got something out of that, and understand the importance of really trying to understand the light and the materials and how they respond to these things. And I look forward to seeing any posts if anybody wants to show that stuff off. Cheers, and Merry Christmas for those that celebrate it.